Hey, everybody, and welcome back to Autism Confidential, the podcast from the National Council on Severe Autism. I am Jill Escher. I'm your host today, and I'm president of NCSA. Today, I am in conversation with our vice president, Dr. Amy Lutz. Welcome, Dr. Lutz.
Hi, Jill.
And today we will be talking about a new commentary that was just recently published in the journal Autism Research, which is the journal of the International Society for Autism Research. The commentary is called "A Full Semantic Toolbox is Essential for Autism Research and Practice to Thrive." And Amy and I are both co-authors of this commentary, along with Allison Singer of Autism Science Foundation and Dr. Alicia Halliday, who is also at Autism Science Foundation and is also on faculty at Rutgers University. So this was, I feel, a very important commentary. It really kind of delved into reasons why we need to hold on to all kinds of language to describe people and issues around autism. And it was really crafted in response to what has been a growing movement in the neurodiversity community to sharply limit the types of language that we can use to describe autism and people with autism. And before I kind of launch into this with Amy, I want to kind of give you a quick overview of two of these papers that we cited in our commentary. The first one I want to address was called "First Do No Harm." It was a very short, kind of 3-page commentary in the journal Pediatrics, which is the journal of the American Academy of Pediatrics. It was published in April 2022 by Dwyer et al. This commentary by neurodiversity advocates kind of argued that the language we use around autism affects the mental health of people with autism. And they feel any language that is, what they consider to be disparaging or stigmatizing or grounded in what they call the medical model or has value judgments, right? Or what they see as value judgments overlaying it. Anything with this quote unquote negative connotation has a negative effect on the mental health of people with autism and therefore should be scrubbed from the vocabulary that researchers and clinicians use to describe and discuss autism. So I'm going to give you some examples. They suggested that the word disorder be eliminated, and instead we use the word disability. That instead of autism spectrum disorder, we say autism spectrum development. That instead of talking about deficits, we talk about areas of challenges, and that we eliminate the word symptoms and instead just talk about characteristics. Instead of restricted interests, talk about them as intensive interests. Don't use the word risk for autism. Instead, use a term like likelihood for autism because there's nothing inherently negative about autism, so why use the word risk? And that we don't talk about prevention of autism. We only talk about preventing and treating co-occurring conditions, but not the autism itself. Now, a second paper that we cited was from Fatima Boutel, I'm not sure how to pronounce her name, et al. This paper was published in 2021. It was called "Avoiding Ableist Language: Suggestions for Autism Researchers." And it was published in a much lesser journal, kind of journals, you guys might not understand this, but there's sort of a hierarchy of journals, and some journals are kind of very low in terms of their value or their influence and their validity, and some are very high. But this was in a journal that kind of ranks pretty low called Autism in Adulthood. It was about 8 or 9 pages, and it went into more depth than the other one. But it basically attacked language that they felt perpetuated ableist ideologies. And it sees language as a powerful means for shaping how people view autism, right, and other disorders or conditions. And it asked researchers to take steps to avoid this quote unquote ableist language. And it was the list that they offered was pretty similar to the other one, but it had some additional little nuggets like we can't use the term special needs. We can't refer to the economic burden of autism. We can't refer to high or low severity. We can't use the words burden or suffering associated with autism. Can't use the word treatment or symptom or psychopathology. Can't use the word puzzle or epidemic, as if, there's been no increase in autism whatsoever, which of course is preposterous. It also went further. It called for participatory research, that autistic people are included in the research process conducted by non-autistic investigators, and that editorial decisions made by non-autistic publishers elevate autistic voices. It also said that the autistic people involved in all these efforts should be paid for their participation, and that autistic people in academia should be promoted to ensure that they play leading roles in autism research. It also asked researchers to ask themselves 7 questions around the language they use around autism before they publish. So it was it asked quite a lot. So Amy, I'm sorry for that long preface, but I feel people have to understand the sort of insanity of what's been published and why we did what we did. So Amy, why don't you tell people a little bit about what our commentary says?
Well, first of all, I just want to say that I completely agree with the second paper's claim that language is incredibly important and deserving of this kind of conversation, because it does shape the way the public thinks about autism, the way policymakers think about autism. So just as an unrelated example, NCSA does a lot of advocacy around housing issues. And something that has long impressed me in this world is the incredibly impressive discursive bait and switch that neurodiversity advocates have accomplished in changing the definition of institution. So whereas before institution, you might think of Willowbrook or Pennhurst. Willowbrook had 6,000 residents, and that was a snake pit institution. No one's trying to bring that back. But now, according to neurodiversity advocates, an institution is anything more than 4 people. Like, to me, and policymakers are like, okay, we won't allow anything larger than 4 people because that's institutional, and nobody has pushed back. I'm like, oh my goodness, I just can't believe that people are accepting this definition from 6,000 to 4. Certainly there's some space in between that we could have some discussions about some larger settings that are not the size of those, those state institutions. So the fact that if you can change the meanings of words and how you deploy those words, those do have real material effects in kind of the lives of autistic people and their families. And so we felt it was imperative to push back against this sanitizing of autism. Like, we couldn't sit back and let researchers be told that you only have to describe autism in a positive way when our families are living with the severe manifestations of autism, including very dangerous, aggressive, self-injurious behavior, elopement, pica, real medical comorbidities, including gut issues and so forth. And to only describe autism, to be confined to only describing autism in positive ways, would eliminate so much necessary research and practice that our families are in desperate need of. So that's why we got together with our colleagues at the Autism Science Foundation to write this critique, which has been really well received by researchers who have been feeling a lot of pressure to conform to these suggestions by neurodiversity advocates, and have actually, they've had grant proposals denied and papers rejected for publication because they failed to conform to these guidelines. And we felt we just couldn't sit by and let that happen.
Yeah, really, absolutely. I've only received really positive feedback from people in the field who've been just so grateful that we gave voice to something that they've been feeling and thinking kind of quietly, right? But we said it out loud, and we hope that our commentary really helps to change the conversation away from this kind of need to walk on eggshells about every word we use about autism, to instead just when what we say in the commentary is we're not being prescriptive. We're not putting a list out like these other people did.
Right.
We're saying use the words that you feel are most accurate, and most kind of descriptive, right, of what you see in your research and what you see in the clinic.
Yeah, I think that's an important distinction to make, because one of the one of the responses from the neurodiversity world I saw on Twitter was, researchers can't use any language that they want to, like that we were advocating the use of disparaging or pejorative language. And that is absolutely not what we meant. We certainly don't.
And we were very explicit actually in saying
we're not talking about calling people with intellectual disabilities retarded or being just unnecessarily aggressive about or disparaging against our population. Of course not. These are the people that we love the most in the world. Our point was that you should not sanitize medical language that accurately describes behavior. The fact that you have to find some positive spin on kind of the aggression that lands a kid in like an inpatient unit was frankly just surreal to us. Like what researchers are focusing on and what we want them to focus on more are these incredibly, extremely disabling symptoms that often cross into psychopathology of autism. And we need researchers to be able to use that kind of language.
Yeah. And I wanted to say something about a part that you really included in this commentary, which is about partial representation, which was the experience I've had. And I interact with self-advocates all the time. In fact, I was talking to one a couple of weeks ago, and he was kind of talking about his self-concept, right? That, he likes language that kind of promotes his self-concept. I'm like, that's fine. Whatever, gets you through the day, whatever you need, whatever is kind of a therapeutic tool for you, that's great. But what I object to is that bleeding over to kids like mine, and that we have to use language around our children to benefit his self-concept, which I really think is a dynamic going on here. Can you talk about what you meant by partial representation in this paper? Because I think that really is a part and parcel of the same thing.
Yeah, I'm really proud of that paper on partial representation. It was published a year or two ago in the American Journal of Bioethics with some Penn colleagues of mine, Matt McCoy, Dominic Sisti, and Emily Liu. And we were looking at advocacy and autism in specific as a case study. And what we argued is that we came up with this concept called partial representation, which speaks to representation that is both incomplete and biased, and argued that one segment of a very large and heterogeneous community cannot make the claim to speak for that entire community without really actively soliciting input from all the different stakeholders in that community, which is fairly impossible to do in a community as diverse as the autistic community, and certainly didn't happen here. Where certainly parents of severely autistic kids were not consulted by these neurodiversity advocates in the framing of these linguistic rules. And I just want to clarify something you said, Jill, which was that we were very clear in this paper that researchers should tailor their language to reflect the needs and kind of preferences of the kind of populations they're working with. So if they're doing research on very high functioning people with autism and what they need to succeed in college, for example, or in the workforce, they may want to use this strength-based language that's really important to them, and they definitely should do that. But that you don't want to have this blanket rule that applies to all research and is going to most importantly affect the research that is designed to kind of probe issues at our end of the spectrum.
Right. I mean, the harder it becomes to discuss the realities of our children's situation, the more handcuffed that researchers are, the more difficult it will be to have, for example, a grant application that addresses some of the really dire realities of severe autism. The more difficult it will be to argue for treatment, right? For people. We just recorded an episode about ECT, for example, right? Which is a treatment that addresses very beneficially a certain subset of cases with severe forms of autism. And these things are absolutely vital to progress in the autism realm, right? You need to be able to define and address a problem before you can find a solution, right? And
Yeah.
if you're like, oh, I'm sorry, I can't quite discuss that because that would be viewed as something negative, right, by some neurodiversity people, that's just another obstacle in the way of progress. So we feel very strongly that, as we said, the full semantic toolbox should be open to anybody writing about autism or working with the autism population. Another thing that really was kind of strikingly kind of dangerous is this idea of participatory research that is very narrowly defined. This wasn't in the pediatrics article, it was more in the autism and adulthood article, but participatory research in autism has come to mean research that involves people with autism, right? As
Yeah.
kind of people who provide guidance, right, or advice. Well, what it doesn't include is, representation of kids like ours, right, who can't self-advocate and don't have that kind of cognitive capacity to serve on a committee, right, to define research objectives forever. I mean, it's to call it participatory research is completely insane because it completely cuts out a huge swath of the autism population.
Yeah, I mean, this is part of this larger fight. This is the reason why NCSA kind of was born, right? Is that this kind of demand from neurodiversity advocates that only autistic self-advocates, only autistic adults can speak for the autistic population. Parents cannot speak for their severely autistic kids. And if their severely autistic kids can't speak for themselves, like these kind of mildly impacted autistic adults are better positioned to speak for our kids who they've never met and have no comprehension of what their issues are. So we've been fighting to assert our need to represent our kids and advocate for them and just have a seat at the table in all of these, in research, in clinical practice, in policy discussions. So this is just part of a larger move for disability rights to kind of try to shut parents out. And by doing that, they shut out the most severely impacted by their intellectual and developmental disabilities. And that's going to just create a world that has no services and supports for our kids.
Right. I think ultimately exactly what we are concerned with are the practical implications,
Yeah,
right,
for sure.
of this sort of sanitization, this sort of Orwellian cleansing, right, of language, is that we are more and more marginalized, right, in research and clinical efforts. So some very real implications here. So Amy, what I want to do in closing is I want to go over some of these terms,
Okay.
right, in their kind of glossary of acceptable terminology, and I want to get some of your feedback.
Okay.
All right, they say we shouldn't use the word disorder. What do you think?
I mean, first of all, autism spectrum disorder as defined in the DSM is a disorder, right? If you don't suffer significant impairments in functioning, you don't meet the diagnostic criteria for autism. So to me, this trying to just like a real explicitly trying to reframe autism as an identity that can be claimed by people on TikTok who self-diagnose because they like fidget toys, like it's for so many families, autism is so disabling. It is such a disorder that just cripples the lives of individuals and their families. And, of course, that's our reality, that it is, you cannot pretend that it's not a disorder.
I mean, if what my kids have isn't a disorder, I don't know what is.
Yeah.
I mean, if you have a kid who can't talk, can't read, can't write, can't go to the bathroom by themselves, can't put on their own clothes, needs supervision 24/7, 365, tell me that nothing on the earth is a disorder. Yes. Okay, let's go through just a few more. How about deficit? We shouldn't use the word deficit. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's the deficits that we have to, that we really need to focus on, because if we can make those a little less severe, if we can help support and kind of provide some solutions to those deficits, we can really increase the opportunities our kids have to go out in the world and participate. And to focus on their strengths, I mean, like it's really the deficits, including like things we've talked about, aggression, self-injury, elopement, that really restrict their opportunities to be out in the world. So that's what I focus on in Jonah's programming, and just trying to give him more independence and be able to achieve and access more of the things that he wants. And to do that, he has to learn, not to run away when we're out in the community, and he has to learn not to chuck his iPad out, the window of a moving vehicle. And these are deficits, and these are things we need to respond to, because otherwise he's going to be stuck at home. And well, yes, he has some great strengths. He was like hyperlexic as a child. He could read, he could say the alphabet, just as fast backwards as he could say it forwards. But in the end, that's not what determines his quality of life.
Well, autism is defined by deficits. It's defined by impairments. Autism is not defined by strengths. Now, granted, my daughter has strengths. She's a great skier. We went ice skating yesterday. She did great. She's got the biggest smile and the biggest heart and loves dancing. She definitely has strengths, but that's not what makes her autistic. What makes her autistic is the fact that she has incredible impairments when it comes to communication and social communication and repetitive behaviors. That's what defines autism. So it seems absolutely like incredible to me that anyone would contemplate removing language like that from the discourse around autism. Okay, just one more. We're not supposed to talk about risk and prevention, according to these neurodiversity proponents. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, risk, now we're kind of getting into some epidemiological terms, and that's probably more, your bailiwick there, Jill, about how necessary that term is. But I will say, just as the parent of other kids, there isn't anything that I worry about more, or that should be of more concern to them as they plan their families when they get older, is, what is the likelihood of them having children who are severely affected like Jonah? What are some strategies that might keep that from happening? And, that research, I know, is of incredible importance to families like mine. And I would hate to see that derailed.
Yeah, me, I am very, very deeply involved in research around what might be causing autism in some cases. And obviously I do this with an eye to prevention. I think there has been this unfortunate development in the neurodiversity world where it's just accepted very uncritically that autism is always some sort of natural occurrence that is just part of the human condition that's always been here, and it hasn't increased in prevalence at all. It's just something to be celebrated and accepted, where I take the complete opposite approach. I'm like, I cannot believe how much autism there is now in our communities. California, its Department of Developmental Services, which only counts the more severe cases, has gone from 3,000 cases about 35 years ago to 138,000 cases today. I mean, these are not subtle increases. These are massive increases comparing apples to apples over time. We've seen similar data come from New Jersey, and certainly the CDC data is showing increases over time that cannot be explained by shifts in diagnosis. So I cannot tell you how much of this kind of language stripping is actually kind of rooted in this philosophy about autism as a naturally occurring condition that's always been there and hasn't increased in prevalence, when I think there is absolutely nothing in the research literature to support that view, and it's a very dangerous view. So these efforts, I think, are sometimes rooted in just misinformation, and it's very scary. Okay, so I think we're going to come to a close here, Amy. I want to say that it's really, really important that we continue to fight kind of efforts to turn autism into a propaganda machine. And
Absolutely.
it
Autism
really
is
has
not an
been to it,
identity.
not an
Autism is not an
identity.
identity like homosexuality. Autism is like a devastating disorder at our end of the spectrum, and we can't let that be eclipsed from the conversation. And this move by neurodiversity advocates to control the actual words used to describe autism is, to me, the most blatant grab at kind of sanitizing autism and being able to push this identity narrative instead.
Yeah, I agree. Very good. And everybody, this journal commentary in Autism Research that we've been discussing is open access, which means you don't have to pay. There's no paywall. You can go get it. And we will put in the show notes a link to the article. But if you just want to do a quick Google search, you may do so and you will find it. Again, I'm going to give you the full title. A full semantic toolbox is essential for autism research and practice to thrive. Thank you, Amy, and I'm sure we will see you again soon here on Autism Confidential.
Thanks, Jill. I'm so proud of this article that we did. I can't tell you.
Thank you. Thanks for tuning in to Autism Confidential. If you'd like to learn more, share an idea for an episode, or become a sponsor, please visit us at autismconfidential.org. The views expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individual speakers. Content presented is for informational purposes only, and we do not provide any medical or legal advice.